Okay, thanks Shamel for the introduction, and thanks Rob for all the organisational technical help that underlies this talk, and thank you all for coming, whether you're in the room or online. It's a real pleasure to be here, to be back in Manchester, amongst familiar friends and faces. This is a bit new to me, this dual delivery thing, probably is to all of us. I've been told to talk to the room, so if you're online, apologies, I'm talking to the room, but obviously I'm talking to you all really. And also I'm standing just slightly to the side, so I'm not looking right into the projector. So hopefully you can all hear me and see the slides. So a few other thank yous to start. I must thank the Hallsworth Fund for its financial support and the folks that worked behind the scenes to facilitate my visiting professorship here. Greatly appreciated. And also I need to thank my host for this visit, Martin Hess, who is sadly unable to be here in person. But if you're out there online, Martin, I'm sending you my best wishes and hope to see you soon. I just checked my diary. The last time I spoke to a room full of people was 10th of March 2020. Strange world. Okay, so I'd like to start, as I always do, by just outlining my central aim, in case I forget to do it later on. So I think it's always good to be clear at the outset. So what I'm trying to do in this talk today is to explore whether the labour regimes concept, and I'll explain what I mean by that, has the potential to offer an integrated perspective on the nature of work in global production networks. So can labour regimes as an idea, as a concept, help us unpack the nexus between work and global production? And I'm going to deliver these ideas in 4 main sections. So here's the outline for the talk. The first part is to kind of position what I want to say against the general discussions about labour and global production. So the first section is somewhat introductory. In the second section, I'm going to look at labour regimes as a concept, its origins and its recent re-emergence as an idea within that broader literature. And I'm going to do that by looking at 3 phases of intellectual development from the 1970s to the present day. In the third section, I'm then going to try and put those ideas into practice to try and convince you that they may have analytical traction for understanding labour in global production. I'm going to do that by looking at a study of the Bangladeshi and Sri Lankan apparel industries. It's a comparative study, and it draws on the recently completed PhD of my student Charmaine Wickramasinghe. And then finally, in the fourth part of the talk, I want to try and look forward a bit and think about what a research agenda might look like in relation to labour regimes. What are the key challenges and things that we need to know more about? And there I'm going to draw on ongoing work with 3 scholars at Queen Mary University of London, Elena Baglioni, Liam Campling and Adrian Smith, and draw on an edited book in this area that we're just currently completing. Okay, so starting with the broad intellectual context. So I'm sure many of us in the room are aware, over the last 25 years or so, a very broad and deep literature has emerged on the topic of global production. And we've got a kind of window onto that literature on the screen at the moment. And this literature goes far beyond simple analysis of TNCs. Rather, it looks at how organisationally and spatially fragmented production systems now constitute the key architecture of the global economy. This literature looks at how these production systems operate and to what effect in social, economic, and increasingly environmental terms. So why and how does the global organisation of industries matter on the ground? And there are different strands within this literature, and this table tries to give you a window on 3 of those. We can think about it in terms of the disciplinary background, the objects of inquiry, the key concepts, the intellectual influences. So the global value chain approach, where we have economic sociology, development studies and industry studies, will be well known to many of us in the room and listening online, and has looked extensively at the sectoral logics of global industries. That's closely connected to, overlaps with, the global production network approach, emerging out of economic geography and international political economy, where the key focus is on the regional development outcomes of these production networks. Slightly more removed, but also an important part of the conversation, is work on global outsourcing and fragmented trade networks in international trade economics and supply chain management literature. So we can look at it in terms of similarities or differences. There are different points of emphasis, there are different intellectual influences, there are different concepts. But here I'm looking at this in the round, as a suite of approaches trying to understand the reorganization of the global economy in recent decades. So here I'm more concerned with the similarities. When I use GPN and global production networks, that's because it's my preferred approach, but I'm using it as a window onto this school of work. Now, this field continues to expand very quickly thematically. Here's a figure based on a literature mapping I did with my colleague Henry Young about 2 years ago, which is just one attempt to get a handle on this complicated intellectual endeavor. So you've got GPN theory of the literature and global production in the middle. And what we did here was identify 5 thematic interfaces, whereby the core focus of GPN analysis on interfirm networks is being productively expanded into these different domains. So we just go around them quickly, a whole series of debates about development, what counts as development, what should count as development, and how that intersects with global production configurations. Growing interest in the environment, both in narrow terms, in terms of how we might make GPNs more sustainable, and in more fundamental terms, about the kind of ecological foundations of all forms of global production and how they might be shifting in unsettling ways. A lot of work at the GPN finance interface, moving up the left-hand side, thinking about how finance itself is organized through particular forms of global production networks, but again, thinking more fundamentally about how finance is foundational to all of these economic activities. People in GDI have done excellent work in recent times on the top one, the state, and the way in which the state intersects with GPNs. Again, we can think of it in narrow terms towards the center of the circle, the state as an actor within global production networks, and also we can think more broadly about the foundational roles of the state. And you can see where I'm going to with this. I want to focus on that 5th bubble, the labor one today. And again, we can look at that intersection. We could think narrowly about whether labor is an actor within GPNs, or we can think more fundamentally about how GPNs are labor systems and are constituted through labor regimes. And that's the kind of space that I'm going to be exploring today. Of course, setting it up like this, I'm not saying that there are not interconnections between these domains. Of course, there are. It's just one representation of a very vibrant and rich literature. Okay, so let's zoom in then on that global production labor interface. And the literature I would describe as labor studies, labor geography, global labor studies, different terminology for labeling this kind of work. Now, about 10 years ago, it was often said this global production literature largely ignored labor, that labor was a real silence in these debates, other than as a kind of simple factor of production. 10 years on, that now does not hold as an observation. An awful lot of work has emerged looking at different aspects of labor in global production. And I'd identify the following strands, the different versions, if you like, of this ongoing conversation. And in orange, I've highlighted some of the people I think have contributed to these debates. So discussions about the impacts on labor of global production. And social upgrading has proven to be a very useful idea for thinking about whether working in global production systems leads to improvements in terms and conditions for workers. Upgrading or downgrading, of course, can also occur. Some have chosen to focus on the power and agency of labour within global production. Labour agency, if you like. PRA stands for Power Resources Approach, a very popular approach in the labour studies literature for looking at the different power tools, if you like, that workers have in relation to global production networks. So impacts, agency. Another group of scholars have been urging us to look back inside the workplace, to look at the labour process. What's going on in the workplace? Because this is, after all, where value is created and enhanced. So that's another current in these debates. Another group of scholars have been saying, well, that's okay, but we also need to look beyond the workplace, the opposite impulse. We need to look at the wider household economies, the kind of livelihoods, the networks of migration, the diasporic networks, the global households and so on, that workers are often embedded in. So the work of Phil Kelly, Gerd Deneve, Elena Baglioni and so on has been pushing us to think more broadly about the lives of workers. And a final rich strand that I would identify has been to do with regulation and intersecting domains of regulation, and in particular, the interface between national domestic forms of labour regulation and globally organised private regulation schemes, codes of conduct, multi-stakeholder initiatives, and so on. And Tim Bartley and Rick Locke have, I think, done some of the best work in that space. So there are different strands, emphasising different things, different points of focus. What I'm interested in is whether the labour regime and recent attempts to resurrect this idea can be useful as a way of bringing some of these different ideas and some of these different currents together. So the key analytical task, as I would diagnose it, is that we're interested in explaining labour conditions, experiences and agency in global production networks. In other words, in spatially and organisationally fragmented global production systems. And to put it in crude terms to start with, that necessitates intersecting two different dimensions. First of all, there's a transnational network dimension. This is to do with the market conditions, the interfirm governance that's central to GVC and GPN approaches, the managerial regimes and sectoral specificities that may characterize an agri-food sector vis-a-vis electronics, for example, and the modes of private regulation that prevail in different contexts. Now, in the literature, this is often called in the shorthand the vertical dimension. Okay, kind of the global vertical dimension. We also need to hold that in tension, though, with what's often called the horizontal dimension, the national, regional, and local territorial dimensions of work and labour. And we know what these are: labour regulation and the extent to which labour regulation is enforced, linked to state capacity, labour cultures, labour markets, reproduction dimensions, the extent to which they're labour market intermediaries, the extent to which informal labour is integral to labour system. So the analytical task, as I see it, is to think about how to mobilise and integrate these two dimensions simultaneously. Now, in setting that up, I recognise that is a simplification. Labour can also organise across the vertical dimension through various transnational networks. Firms can get involved in the horizontal dimension through political activities in particular contexts. But just as a useful framing device to think about the space we're talking about here, hopefully that's productive. So in effect, we're talking about the dynamics, the intersections of production systems. In this case, this is unhelpful. They flipped around the vertical and the horizontal as I just set it up. But this is kind of a diagrammatic representation of the nexus. So you've got what I call the vertical dimension, the value chain, the production network going left to right. But just imagine I called it vertical. But that intersects in different contexts with different national, institutional, and regulatory environments. So this is just one attempt in the literature. They call it a configurational framework to kind of start mapping out this complicated nexus. So what then would be an initial definition or explanation of what I mean by a labour regime? So here's how we try to put it in the book. I'll come back to at the end. And it's called: a labour regime signals the combination of social relations and institutions that bind capital and labour in a form of antagonistic relative stability in particular times and places. So it's a kind of on-the-ground reality of how capital and labour are bound together in particular sites. But those sites are in turn interconnected with one another. So put it another way, what we're looking for here is exploring whether labour regimes is an important or useful mediating concept that allows us to bridge between capital-labour relations in the general sense and specific on-the-ground dynamics of labour control and agency within individual workplaces. So it's deliberately an attempt to forge a kind of meso-level or middle range theory. Okay, so that's the first part. Some comments about setting this up, the broader intellectual landscape and how I think labour regimes might contribute. So let's now move to the second part and look at the lineage of the term labour regimes. And as I said at the start, I want to do that by looking at 3 phases of work. And this is a geographical reading. So I'm splitting these three phases up chronologically. I'm diagnosing different emphases in terms of the scales of relations that are prioritised in this work. Again, as in all such attempts, it's a bit of a simplification, but I think it does provide some purchase on these debates. So I want to start with the labour process theory tradition. That's what LPT stands for at the top, that emerged in the 1970s and 80s and was really kick-started by Harry Bravman's seminal work on labour control and the degradation of work in the early 70s, his so-called de-skilling thesis. But the term labour regimes, it first starts to be brought to life by the work of Michael Borrowoy in his 2 very famous books in 1979 and 1985, where he talks about, firstly, the manufacturing of consent, how and why do workers come to work every day, and the politics of production. And in the second book, The Politics of Production, 1985, you see it on the right, Borrowoy talks through the notion of a factory regime. So he's calling it a factory regime, not a labour regime, but we're getting the similar idea. And here he looks at the importance of national context and the kind of alignments between capital and state. He often called them despotic because of their negative characteristics that emerge in particular national context. And he also looks at the implications of those for social reproduction and the welfare state. So here's the first attempt then, toggling between the workplace and the national context, to think about different kinds of labour regimes on the ground. Other people at the same time working in parallel on similar ideas. So Henry Bernstein's work in development studies, looking at agricultural labour regimes in colonial and post-colonial contexts. So his book there, for example, Class Dynamics of Agrarian Change, again using the idea of a labour regime to pass different kinds of post-colonial agricultural transitions. Knights and Wilmot, in another famous contribution to this debate, bringing the discursive dimensions of discipline. So they start to lead to a kind of post-structural term, labour process theory, looking at how knowledge and power about kinds of work feeds into labour control. So these are pen pictures, but the point here is we can trace the roots of this idea back to this particular period and these scholars. And what I would say at the outset is, I think now, looking back, there are missing scales because the focus here is primarily on the workplace and the national, and also there are missing actors if we look at the contemporary context. This is pretty much focused on firms and states. To just give you a couple of examples of people working in this vein. So here's Henry Bernstein's quote about what a labour regime might be and how it might be useful. Labour regimes usefully encapsulate the interrelation of segmented labour markets and recruitment, conditions of employment and labour processes, and forms of enterprise authority and control when they coalesce in sociologically well-defined clusters with their own discernible logic and effects. Now, they're saying sociologically defined because I'm interested in the extent to which they're geographically defined as well. And people continue to use these ideas and Borrowoy's notions as inspiration today. So here's Dennis Arnold, Stephen Campbell, writing only a few years ago, very much harking back to that Borrowoy idea. Our use of labour regime is in close affinity to Borrowoy, but we emphasise consent-seeking mechanisms located at sites and at scales beyond the point of production. So they're saying we need to bring in these extra scales, as I alluded to. The second phase I've called inserting the local or regional scale. I can also call it enter the economic geographers. And 2 key contributions in the mid-90s from economic geographers started to suggest that just toggling between the workplace and the national labour market was not satisfactory, and that we needed to look at spatial variation within national labour markets. So first of the 2 was Jamie Peck, who in his 1996 book, Workplace, really kind of theoretically explained why we would expect labour markets to vary from place to place within the same national context. And he explained that through the intersection of 2 dialectics, production and reproduction, and regulation. So he, in great detail, explained why we'd expect there to be a lot of variation within a national labour system. That's been very influential work, particularly in economic geography. Susan Hanson and Jerry Pratt making similar arguments with evidence from Worcester in New England at the same time in their 1992 book. The second contribution was by another economic geographer called Andy Jonas, who coined the term local labour control regime, LLCR. And here he was identifying a mode of social regulation derived from a reciprocal relationship between processes and institutions of production, consumption, and labour reproduction in a particular geographical setting. So you see the diagram on the right, 3 domains of production, reproduction, and consumption. And he's arguing that there's a fully developed local labour control regime at the middle where those domains intersect. So this is injecting a new scale of analysis, but also broadening thematically what's taken to constitute the labour regime. And again, people continue to use those ideas today. So Jonathan Pattenden, who works at, in East Anglia, he's used the local labour regime concept to understand labour systems in contemporary India, bringing in ideas of class dynamics and caste to augment the ideas of Jonas. So again, just a quote to give you a flavour of this kind of work in Jonas's own words. Local labour control regimes are constructed out of the day-to-day and locally situated struggles among and between capital, industries, workers, public agencies and community organisations, and exist in a changing context of local, national and global power geometries. Now, what's the gap I'm going to diagnose here? Well, the global dimensions, when you read Jonas, are very underplayed and thinly theorised. We think writing in 1996, this was at the early stages, what we might now call hyperglobalisation, and the kind of the insights of the GVC and GPN literature were not really brought to bear. The third phase looks at work over the past decade when authors have started to flesh out that missing global dimension in labour regime analysis that I just identified. I'll just give you some examples of work in this space. So one paper that I found very useful when starting to think this through was a piece in 2011 by Lonnie Riscard and colleague Hammer, who were looking at the cut flower and banana industry. And they were looking at labour rights strategies, and they started to argue that labour rights strategies in particular contexts were affected by both the dimensions I've been introducing. The nature of the global value chain, the extent to which it is driven, the extent to which there is a brand with consumer recognition involved, but also the nature of the local labour control regime. Though there's slippage in their paper when you read it, they're effectively talking about a national labour control regime. Mark Hanna is another example in a very well cited and quite well known paper by now. He holds the industry constant and looks at the global apparel industry and looks at the connection between particular national labour regimes and the kind of labour agency that he says will kind of emerge from the particular context. And he gives examples from Vietnam and Bangladesh to look at how the particular nature of labour control at the national level leads to different kinds of agency and resistance, wildcat strikes, international accords, cross-border organising. Another important body of work, though, that we need to bring in here is a long-running set of analyses by feminist scholars, development studies, economic geography, and so on, that Jen Baer calls feminist GVC analysis. And she argues that this is an evolution of kind of feminist new international division of labour work from the 1980s to the 2000s. And in her words, she says, what is distinctive about this analytical mode is its central concern with understanding how gender is imbricated in the value relations that give GVCs their organisational and spatial expression. And there's lots of work now in this vein, particularly in the last decade, the work of authors like Steph Barrientos, Elena Baglioni, Annalise Goga, Marion Werner, who position gender relations as central to global value chain restructuring, not simply as an outcome. So the point here is that the reworking of gender relations is fundamental to global production networks. It's not kind of an externality or an impact. So in other words, it's about greater understanding of how vertical relations between firms impact and depend upon the labour processes within them. So if we start to aggregate up and think about these three phases of work on labour regimes broadly defined, we can start to have a sense of how labour regimes are scaled, how they are constructed at and across different spatial scales. The first phase emphasising the workplace and the national, the second phase bringing in the local and the regional, and the third phase emphasising the global. So here's just a diagram from a textbook I was involved in quite a long time ago now. I won't dwell on that. Just a representation of that kind of scalar nature of labour regimes, with the workplace in the middle, embedded in a local labour control regime, a national labour control regime of different types. In some contexts, that's embedded in a macro-regional regime, for example, the European Union, NAFTA and its descendants, etc. And then potentially, even broader than that, some kind of emerging global control regime. We use Burrowise hegemonic despotism idea, but really we're getting that kind of neoliberalism in that. So this is the kind of way of thinking about it that I draw from that literature. Oh, went the wrong way. Sorry about that. Okay, so to my mind, the most convincing and fully fledged contribution in this vein is the work of Adrian Smith et al., published 3 years ago in the journal Economic Geography, and they were using a particular case study of apparel in Moldova. And they really started to flesh out what a multi-scalar perspective on labour regimes might look like, if you look on the right. So they start with the labour regime as ultimately being forged in the workplace through the labour process, wage relations, labour control, and so on. And they think about how that's embedded in those different nested scales that I just introduced. So regional political economy. So this comes from the economic geography, it's the subnational space. The national political context that's been emphasised from Burrowise onwards. And at the top, you can't see it because there's a bar in a way, but that says lead firm dynamics. The box at the top is the global production system and the pressures this imparts on that nested series of labour regimes. So in their own words, local and workplace labour regimes can be conceptualised as historically formed multi-scalar phenomena resulting from the articulation of struggles over local social relations, intersecting with lead firm contracting practices. So again, this is a more sophisticated way of framing that intersection of the vertical and the horizontal that I started out with. So on the basis of this review, this kind of genealogy of labour regimes, we can have a first stab at detailing the analytical parameters of labour regimes, start to think about what it might encapsulate as an integrative concept. So it's reflective of temporary stabilizations of capital labour relations, and there's a certain stability and durability that's inherent to the idea of a regime. They intersect globally networked relations with local, regional, and national territorial formations, and they are avowedly multi-scalar. They incorporate workplace dynamics wherein the labour process is actually enacted and experienced. So what goes on in the workplace matters to value creation and generation. At the same time, a labour regime also incorporates the reproductive spheres that underpin labour, household economies, livelihoods, remittances, migration dynamics, and so on. And they are unavoidably and heavily shaped by the politics of class, gender, race, and ethnicity. And the final point to make is they are contested. They are sites of struggle. They have a certain stability, but they also have dynamism that comes from struggle, and the full range of actors is involved in shaping them: capital, state, labour, and civil society. So in my work with Charlemagne, we've tried to tweak and refine the Smith et al. Framework in a kind of inductive manner through work in the apparel industries of Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. And I appreciate this is probably somewhat hard to read, but basically the text in blue is things that we've fed in to augment the Smith et al. Framework. But let me just simplify it by looking at the left-hand side. What we suggest in this analysis is there are three things that the Smith et al. Framework underplays. Firstly, there's a missing actor, which is the role of transnational networks of labour, and in particular the role of international civil society organisations. There's a missing scale, as I'll come on to show. I think we need to separate out the regional scale, which might be a whole province or a state, from the effects and nature of local labour markets. So we're trying to pass the regional, as you can see on the right, and the local scale. And also we feel that the Smith et al. Formulation does not integrate labour agency enough in its analysis. It's very much a tiered structure of governance and control. But from our perspective, we need to incorporate worker agency, both individual and collective, as part of how this system is remade and reproduced. How am I doing time-wise, Rob?
I think about 10-15 minutes left.
Okay. Yeah. So let's move on to part 3 and put some of these ideas to work in this comparison of apparel in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. And helpfully, there will be people on this call or in the room who know a lot more about these two countries. This is going to be sketchy and schematic. Don't have much time, but I'm really trying to give a sense of how the concept might be deployed. So on the screen here, you've got a very basic comparison of the apparel industries of those two countries. So on the left, sorry, again, the titles are obscured. On the left, you have Bangladesh. On the right, you have Sri Lanka. And what we're starting to think about here is one of the similarities in terms of when the industry took off, the key markets, the key lead firms that are involved, the broad constitution of the workforce, broad levels of labour representation. And then what are the important differences in terms of the scale of the industry, the quality of the garments made there, and to put it bluntly, the labour outcomes. And so the conundrum, the core question that underpinned this PhD was whether the idea of a labour regime could help us explain the different labour outcomes given these broad similarities. And a kind of secondary aim was to think about what does it mean if we start to think about subnational scales? If we move beyond just intersecting the global industry in the national context, what does that add in terms of analysis? Okay, so here is the broad outline of the study. A very extensive, comprehensive body of fieldwork for which I can take little credit, other than being the kind of cheerleader in chief. This was down to Shimane, secondary and primary data, but very broad-based range of interviews undertaken in both countries. 94 in Bangladesh, you can see the timings, along with some worker focus groups, 88 in Sri Lanka, 4 focus groups. And if you can read it in blue, here you can see the interviews were with the broad range of labour regime actors, capital, workers, state, and civil society organisations. You can read more in the paper that's in press on this, but that's the kind of methodological basis of the study. Now, there's a lot of detail in the thesis, there's more in the paper, but if I just try and encapsulate in 2 sections what the analysis is about. The first part looks at that classic intersection of global production and national labour system. And those core relationships within global production networks between buyers and suppliers that come up time and time again in the apparel industry literature were once again shown to be very important. In particular, the pressures put by buyers on suppliers in terms of prices and delivery times. I should just say as an aside, this work took place before the pandemic. Okay? These things have been ramped up in the last couple of years for obvious reasons. So that was a key dynamic. The nature of that interface was different. Bangladeshi suppliers were particularly exposed. They tended to operate through so-called captive relations with their buyers. They were seen as low-cost suppliers. The industry and entry into the market were not centrally regulated, and the workforce was seen as lowly skilled. That's not my words, that's how it was described by respondents of many kinds. So Bangladesh has a certain position within global production networks, and the situation is somewhat different in Sri Lanka, where the relations are more relational, to use the GVC terminology. Key aspects here were to do with the Board of Investment, which exerted strong control over market access and what firms do when they're in the market. More generally niche and higher value-added production, and what was seen to be a more capable workforce. Now, where do these different national level intersections come from? Of course, they reflect the particular histories, both colonial and post-colonial, of the two countries. Now, in Bangladesh, a situation has emerged where the industry is often owned or co-opted by the political elite post-independence, and there are relatively weak unions. So there's a large overlap between the political class and the business class. And there's a figure, I think 70% of MPs or politicians have some kind of business interest in the apparel sector. Sri Lanka, historical trajectory is different, a longer history of welfare state and strong trade unions. And this means that the national capital labour state configuration is very different in the two countries, with knock-on consequences for labour terms and conditions. Sri Lanka also provides a more stable basis for the implementation of codes of conduct because it has labour law that is implemented and maintained. So it's become something of a poster child for codes of conduct in this industry. And this also means that international civil society organisations have got involved in different ways. In Sri Lanka, it's been on a kind of case-by-case basis, different issues to female leadership, unionising factories, specific policies, where in the Bangladesh context, international civil society organisations such as the Accord and the Alliance have been actually absolutely fundamental to driving labour governance and the form it takes, particularly post-Rana Plaza. So that's one cut. But then what we're trying to do by mobilising this multi-scalar approach is to look at the subnational dynamics and uneven regimes at the workplace. And what we find is there are important, very regional and local variations in the labour regime that really matter on the ground. So in Sri Lanka, for example, the picture is variable depending on whether you're talking about inside or outside of the EPZs, the 12 export processing zones. Inside the export processing zones, at the time of study, there were labour shortages, there was heavy involvement of labour market intermediaries, there was a lot of contract work, and this was creating fragmented labour regimes within the EPZs, between those on permanent or semi-permanent contracts and those working for agencies. So not only is there a difference whether you're inside or outside an EPZ, even within an EPZ, people are experiencing very different terms and conditions. And also the national level dynamic that characterizes unions and labour representation is also variable. So it's not uniform across Sri Lanka, and also in some places in Bangladesh, there are areas of union strength, largely due to ICSO connections. So these subnational patterns then, in terms of labour terms, conditions and representation, that we argue are analytically interesting and important. So, for example, the union activity in Bangladesh tends to prioritise the Dhaka region because of that political connection. In Sri Lanka, unions are primarily focused on organising within export processing zones and so on. We can also think about other forms of worker agency and labour organisation. A variety of other mechanisms are being set up, participatory committees in Bangladesh, employee councils or worker councils in Sri Lanka and so on. So in the absence of widespread unionism, we see employers pursuing other forums to try and engage with workers. And these have also prompted different forms of workplace strategies of resistance. So we found evidence of finger dragging, spot strikes, and indeed national wildcat strikes, as Mark Anna alluded to, in Bangladesh in 2016 and 2018. In Sri Lanka, the picture was different. Worker agency tended to be enacted through different strategies, direct discussions with management, contract work, job hopping, and so on. So this is where we try to suggest that bringing in a view of labour agency and the form that takes can intersect with labour regimes and how they're remade. So it's not kind of an addendum to, it's part of the remaking of labour regimes, and it's spatially variable. And here we're trying to counter a trend in the literature in recent times, a trend to kind of seek out and find agency everywhere. And just by doing that, that's the kind of analytical goal. And our argument is that just finding agency on its own is a bit pointless if we don't think about how that connects to the nature of regime, whether it reproduces it or has the potential to change the labour regime. Okay, I think I'm running a bit short of time, so what I'll do now, this is drawn from the paper and the thesis. This tries to map that analysis into a comparative figure across the two countries at the 5 different spatial scales. So this is, in other words, a synopsis, a summary of what I was trying to explain on the previous slides, comparing and contrasting all the way down from the way in which the two countries plug into global production networks, to the kind of historical context and nature of the national political economy, and then brings in, towards the bottom of the diagram, some of these uneven patterns within the national space, at the regional level, but at the local level, at the level of the local labour market, or the EPZ. And of course, this is experience. This ultimately has implications at the bottom here in the workplaces. And we know the workplaces are different on average across those two countries. So what I tried to do here is try to use that concept of the multi-scalar labour regime. I realise it's rushed. I realise it was a bit schematic. But think about how that helps us to understand, and in this case, compare two different national labour contexts. Okay, if I can have 5 more minutes, let me just move to the final part. So in the final part of the talk, I just want to highlight what I think are kind of 5 issues, 5 elements of a research agenda in this space moving forward. And this comes from the concluding chapter of the book I mentioned earlier. So this is in collaboration with those colleagues. So 5 gaps, 5 areas I think that need more attention. One is to do with structures of capital. Now this might be an odd thing to say, but you read a lot of studies of labour in global production, and actually the global production network or the global value chain is quite often black box. It's kind of out there, but the impacts, the precise way in which that is organised are not tracked through. The difference that makes on the ground is often not made clear. So as my colleague Henry Young puts it in typically provocative form, the analytical key here remains in demonstrating how changing dynamics in production systems are causally linked to uneven outcomes in work conditions and labour rights. As he puts it, how does the global make a difference to if people are employed in national or local production networks? This involves looking, of course, beyond lead firms and looking at the various and often competing classes of capital that are involved in global production networks, which range from large transnational corporations all the way through to self-employed workers and petty commodity producers. So there's still a need to focus in on, to hone our understanding of the interplay of labour control and agency in different localities and how those are shaped by worker positionality within global production systems, I would argue. The second agenda point is to think about colonial legacies and racialization. Now, as has long been shown in development studies and the feminist literature on the global economy, the creation of difference across race, class, gender, etc., is a kind of social glue that sustains exploitation. It's not an outcome of it, it's fundamental to exploitation and its reproduction in the global systems. Now, while there is quite a bit of work on gender, I think race and the ideas of racial capitalism are still relatively understudied in these debates. So the distinction between racialization as a particular form of exploitation, as Banerjee would call it, under capitalism. So some authors are explicitly using the language of economic imperialism. So Sawandi's book 2 years ago, The New Economic Imperialism, so thinking about colonialism and slavery and their contemporary analogues. So thinking about the racial construction of labour regimes. And there are 2 chapters in the book I've mentioned looking at Foxconn or Hon Hai in Eastern Europe and looking at how their production workforce is heavily racialized in terms of how it's constructed and how it's reproduced. Workers from elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe, Vietnam and Mongolia. The third agenda is about social reproduction and the household. In other words, the dialectical relations between production and social reproduction. Now, I think industrial dormitories are one space that blurs the boundaries between those two domains that are increasingly well understood in the literature. But there are a whole variety of other aspects to the home and the household. The growth of work at home, the articulations of informal household labour with global production networks, the relations of homework to ongoing crises of social reproduction, and a lot of these debates have been brought into consciousness by the COVID pandemic, of course, and the restructuring of work that has related to that. So social reproduction theory has for a long time been telling us that looking at the workplace is starting in the wrong place. We're doing things back to front. Maybe we should be looking at the home and the household and how those are reproduced and thinking about how different forms of work feed into that. So provocative way of approaching labour regime. The fourth one is perhaps an obvious one. You probably saw this one coming, which is to do with ecology and climate change, perhaps the most pressing. And what's interesting is most research on climate change, energy transition, sustainability, science, and so on, tends to ignore or bracket out the implications for work and labour. So it's a very interesting special issue on the intersections between labour, geography, and climate change in a recent issue of Area. And the editors argue that climate change is about the remaking of work. That's another way of thinking about it. But that connection between labour and climate change is only thinly theorised. There are clues in work, ongoing work, political ecology, critical resource geography, the political economy of natural resources. The examples tend to be drawn from agriculture, food, forestry, and mining. And there we can think about how the labour process is itself a metabolic relation and the kind of ecological indeterminacy that's inherent to capitalism and labour regimes. So issues like climate change, Green New Deals, just transition, these are co-constituted, these necessitate labour regime change. So this suggests there should at least, hypothetically at least, be a productive interface for thinking about those intersections. 3 screens to go, if you're flagging. So the final fifth agenda item is to look in more detail at the role of labour discourse. It's almost to bring in a post-structural bent to the analysis and look at the discursive work that holds labour regimes together across scale. So I did some early work on this with my colleague Phil Kelly in Singapore, looking at how Singapore was looking to remake its labour market post-Asian economic crisis in the late 90s. And this was partly about telling a new narrative about the labour market. It was all about innovation, new economy, knowledge-based economy. Now that's kind of dated work now. But I think it's important work to look at how powerful elites construct labour regimes as desirable or non-desirable in certain ways. Melissa Wright's well-known book on construction of disposable women within global production networks is another example of such work. But we can also think about the struggles of more progressive or more positive discourses of global production to do with ethical production, better work, sustainability, and fair trade. So the challenge here is to take up David Levy's observation some 13 years ago now, that GPNs are not just about struggles over value, they're also about struggles over discourses and how things are understood and represented. And they inevitably have a wider politics. And I think this is a useful lens through which to view multi-scalar labour regimes. So challenges remain. To me, this is an exciting agenda. I think there are things to be working on. Some of the challenges, as I see it, scale, working across scales and working out processes operating at and across different scales is challenging. And scale means different things to different people. So as an economic geographer, I think I know what I mean by it, but I know that other people don't always receive it in the same way. So multi-scalar work is analytically challenging and needs to be very precisely done. Boundaries and methods, where do labour regimes end and start? Probably seems like labour regimes equal capitalism, what I've said, it involves everything. To a certain extent, yes, but we're trying to look really foreground the labour dimension. But yeah, where do we stop and start methodologically? The challenges of comparative research, this is a hot topic in human geography more generally, across different sectors and different countries, across fields and countries, as Tim Bartley put it, is not unproblematic. What exactly are we comparing and on what basis? So I think that is a challenge to this kind of work. And the central one perhaps is, how do we move beyond typologies? In other words, listing the differences between labour regimes towards something that is genuinely more explanatory about the interface between global production and labour regimes. Just a final slide, a couple of references there that I've drawn upon in this talk, and also some advanced publicity for the edited collection that's coming out on labour regimes and global production, hopefully in January 2022. You can find much more about the ideas I've discussed in that. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and back to you, Shimon. Thanks.